Scrub harder. It's still stained. I didn't pay for excuses, Agnes. I paid for a clean floor.
Scrub harder. It's still stained. I didn't pay for excuses, Agnes. I paid for a clean floor. If there is even a shadow of a streak when the caterers arrive, you'll find out exactly how cold the streets are at night. The voice lashed through the penthouse like a whip. Jide stepped into the foyer, his $5,000 suitcase thudding onto the Italian marble. He was home 3 days early from the Tokyo summit, expecting silence and the scent of expensive lilies. Instead, he heard the rhythmic, desperate sound of a brush hitting stone and a sob that sounded like a breaking heart. He rounded the corner into the kitchen and froze. A woman was on her knees, her back bent into a painful curve. She was wearing a cheap gray polyester uniform, the kind worn by the cleaners in his office buildings. Her hands, red and swollen from harsh chemicals, were trembling as she tried to erase a microscopic wine stain. I said, "Clean it." A designer heel, one Jide had paid for, slammed down just inches from the woman's fingers. "Please, Joy," the woman whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "My back, I just need a moment to sit." "You'll sit when the work is done," Joy snapped, her back to Jide. She adjusted the strap of her silk gown, her designer heel hovering inches away from the woman's trembling fingers. "Don't forget why you're here. Jide thinks you're happy in that villa. One word from me, and he'll think you've become a burden he can no longer afford." Jide felt a roar building in his chest, a tidal wave of grief and fury. This was the woman who had worked 3 jobs to put him through school. This was the mother who had hidden her own hunger so he could have a full stomach. He had sent millions of dollars to a private estate account, believing she was being pampered by world-class doctors. Mother? The word was small, choked by the lump in his throat. The woman on the floor stiffened. Slowly, painfully, she lifted her head. When her eyes met his, they weren't filled with the joy of a reunion, but with a terrifying, soul-crushing shame. She tried to hide her red, chemical-burned hands behind her back, shrinking away as if she was the one who had committed a crime. Joy spun around, her face instantly draining of color. The mask of the elegant fiancé fell away, leaving behind the panicked eyes of a cornered predator. "Jide, you're early. I can explain. The cleaning crew didn't show up, and Agnes was she wanted to help." Jide didn't think. He surged forward, his heart slamming against his ribs. He grabbed the woman by the shoulders to pull her away from the aggression. "Stop it!" Jide roared. He was a billionaire who owned the skyline, and he had just found his own mother living like a ghost in his house, hidden by the woman he was supposed to marry. Please kindly subscribe to our channel to help us do more. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how this touched you. Jide didn't explode. He didn't scream or throw Joy out into the hallway. Instead, he became a statue of ice, his corporate mask sliding back into place with a terrifying clinical precision. He helped Agnes to her feet, his touch as gentle as if she were made of spun glass, and led her to the guest suite, a room Joy had claimed was under renovation to keep him from entering. He locked the door from the inside, leaving Joy hyperventilating in the kitchen, her frantic excuses dying against the heavy oak wood. Settling his mother onto the bed, Jide pulled out his encrypted laptop. His fingers, usually steady enough to sign billion-dollar mergers, were humming with a low-frequency rage. He bypassed the glossy monthly wellness reports Joy had emailed him every 4 weeks, PDFs filled with photos of lush gardens and smiling nurses that he now realized were nothing more than stock images and clever forgeries. He dove into the raw data. He followed the digital scent of the $200,000 he had wired every month for Agnes's specialized care. On the surface, the transfers looked legitimate, addressed to Serenity Peak's luxury estate. But as Jide peeled back the layers of the shell company, the estate began to dissolve into a ghost. The bank routing numbers didn't lead to a medical facility in the countryside. They rerouted through a series of shadow accounts before leaping across the ocean. Jide's eyes narrowed as he watched the trail terminate in a private offshore vault in the Cayman Islands under a holding name, JS Enterprises. Joy Sterling, he whispered, the name tasting like ash. He dug deeper, his screen glowing with the cold light of betrayal. He found the invoices Joy had submitted for Agnes's emergency heart procedure last autumn, a $60,000 expense he had paid without a second thought. The timestamp on the invoice matched the exact date Joy had purchased a limited edition diamond necklace from a boutique in Paris. While his mother was being forced to scrub grease from baseboards and eat leftovers in the dark, Joy had been literalizing her greed, wearing his mother's health and dignity around her neck like a trophy. Every thank you Joy had whispered in his ear, every kiss she had given him after he funded another care package was a transaction in a ledger of cruelty. Jide closed the laptop. The data was clear, the paper trail was a roadmap of a sociopath's ambition. He looked at his mother, who had fallen into an exhausted, fitful sleep, her hands still twitching as if searching for a scrub brush in her dreams. He reached out and brushed a stray gray hair from her forehead. Joy thought she was playing a game of social climbing. She didn't realize that she had just handed Jide the coordinates for her own destruction. He wouldn't just fire her. He wouldn't just break the engagement. He would make sure that by the time he was done, the only marble she would ever touch again would be the floor of a prison cell. The dining room was bathed in the warm amber glow of crystal chandeliers, a setting designed for celebration that now felt like a stage for a macabre play. Jide sat at the head of the table, his movements fluid and precise as he cut into a piece of seared wagyu. Across from him, Joy looked radiant in a dress that cost more than Agnes's village house, her smile as perfect and artificial as the silk flowers in the centerpiece. She was back in their element, convinced that her frantic explanations in the kitchen had successfully smoothed over the misunderstanding. "You seem quiet tonight, darling," Joy said, her voice like honeyed poison. She reached across the table, her fingers grazing his hand, the same hand that had just held Agnes's chemical-burned skin. "Is the jet lag finally catching up, or are you still thinking about that little incident with your mother? I've already sent her back to the estate, you know. She was so embarrassed that you saw her like that." Jide took a slow sip of a vintage Bordeaux, the deep red liquid looking like blood against the crystal. "Is that so? I thought she seemed tired, or perhaps overworked." Joy let out a light, melodic laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Jide, you know how she is. She's so used to laboring that she doesn't know how to handle true luxury. I spoke to the head nurse at Serenity Peaks this afternoon. They said she's been thriving. She spent the morning in the hydrotherapy pool and the afternoon in the rose garden. She told them she's never been happier." Jide watched her through the rim of his glass. The ease with which she lied was breathtaking. He thought of the offshore accounts, the forged PDFs, and the way his mother had flinched when Joy's heel struck the floor. He felt a cold, predatory calm settling over him. "The rose garden," Jide repeated softly. "It's a beautiful image. I'm glad the money is being put to such good use. $200,000 a month is quite an investment for the view of the flowers." "It's worth every penny for her peace of mind," Joy replied, leaning back with a satisfied sigh. "I only want the best for our family, Jide. My only regret is that she's so far away, but as we discussed, her health requires that specific isolation." "Isolation," Jide echoed, the word hanging in the air like a sentence. He looked at the empty chair at the other end of the table, imagining his mother sitting there, draped in the silk Joy wore. He realized then that Joy didn't just want his money, she wanted to erase the parts of his life that didn't fit her curated aesthetic. "Well," Jide said, standing up and dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin, "I'm glad she's happy. I think it's time we plan something special for the engagement gala, a true tribute to the women who make our lives possible." Joy's eyes lit up with predatory greed. A tribute? Oh, Jide, that sounds divine. It will be, Jide promised, his voice low and dangerous. It will be exactly what you deserve. The guest suite was a sanctuary of silence, but for Jide, it felt like the scene of a crime. He waited until the early hours of the morning when the penthouse was draped in shadows and Joy was finally asleep, fueled by her own delusions of grandeur. He moved down the hallway, not to his master bedroom, but to the small, cramped servants' quarters tucked behind the laundry room, the place where Agnes had retreated, out of habit and fear, despite his pleas for her to take the guest bed. He found her sitting on the edge of a narrow cot, her back hunched as she mended a tear in the gray polyester uniform. The sight of her, the woman who had birthed a titan, huddled in a room that smelled of bleach and confinement, made Jide's vision blur with a hot, stinging sorrow. "Mother," he said softly, closing the door behind him. Agnes flinched, the needle pricking her finger. She looked up, her eyes wide and wet with unshed tears. "Jide, you shouldn't be here. If she sees you, if she thinks I'm complaining." "She's asleep, Mother. She can't hurt you anymore," Jide said, dropping to the floor to sit at her feet, just as he had done when he was a boy. He took the sewing from her trembling hands. "Why didn't you call me? Why did you let her do this to you?" Agnes let out a broken, shuddering breath. The dam finally burst. "She told me you were under too much pressure, Jide. She said your company was on the verge of collapse because of the scandals your low-class background caused. She said if the world found out your mother was just a village woman with rough hands, the investors would leave, and you'd lose everything." Jide's jaw tightened until it ached. "She used my career to silence you?" "It wasn't just that," Agnes whispered, leaning in as if the walls themselves were listening. "She showed me papers, Jide. She said she had power of attorney. She told me that if I didn't stay out of sight and work to repay the cost of my care, she would have me committed to a state asylum. She said she'd tell the doctors I had dementia, that I was a danger to myself. I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want to embarrass you." Jide felt a cold, murderous clarity wash over him. Joy hadn't just stolen money. She had weaponized his mother's love for him, turning her greatest virtue into a cage. She had gaslit an innocent woman into believing her very existence was a threat to her son's success. "You are the reason I have anything at all," Jide said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. "You could never embarrass me. You are the only person in this building who belongs here." He kissed her scarred knuckles, his mind already spinning the web that would catch Joy. The engagement gala was only days away. Joy wanted a spectacle, a crowning moment to solidify her place in high society. Jide decided then that he would give her exactly that, but it wouldn't be a crown he placed on her head. It would be a mirror, and he would make sure the whole world was watching when she finally had to look at what she really was. The rehearsal for the engagement gala was a masterclass in vanity. The ballroom of the King's Plaza was a hive of activity, draped in cascading white orchids and shimmering silk. Joy stood at the center of it all, commanding the decorators and florists like an empress preparing for a coronation. She looked at the sprawling floor plan, her eyes narrowed with a hunger that no amount of luxury seemed to satisfy. "The centerpieces are too low," Joy snapped, waving a manicured hand at a harried assistant. "I want them towering. People need to feel small when they sit at these tables. And the champagne, switch the vintage to the 1996 reserve. I don't care about the price difference." Jide stood in the shadows of the mezzanine, watching her. He looked at the woman he had intended to share his life with and saw only a hollow shell of ambition. Every demand she made was a fresh withdrawal from the bank of her mother's suffering. Joy spotted him and swept across the floor, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic tempo on the polished wood. She looked perfectly composed, the mask of the doting fiancé firmly back in place after the unfortunate encounter in the kitchen. "Jide, darling, there you are," she purred, reaching out to straighten his lapel. "The planners are being difficult. We're over budget by about 300,000, but for an event of this magnitude, it's necessary. I tried to use the black card for the floral deposit this morning, but there was a technical glitch. I need you to authorize a temporary limit increase." Jide looked down at her, his expression unreadable. He thought of the offshore account in the Caymans, now flagged and frozen by his legal team. He thought of the credit lines he had quietly severed an hour ago. 300,000? Jide repeated, his voice devoid of emotion. "That's a lot of money for flowers that will be dead by morning, Joy." Joy's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of irritation crossing her eyes. "It's not just flowers, Jide. It's our image. It's the legacy we're building. After the way your mother, well, after her recent health struggles, we need to show the world that the King family is stronger than ever." "You're right," Jide said, a cold, dark spark lighting his eyes. "Strength is everything. Don't worry about the credit card. I've taken care of all the payments personally. I want everything to be perfect for the big reveal." Joy beamed, leaning in to kiss his cheek. She didn't notice that he didn't lean back. She didn't feel the icy wall he had built between them. She was already mentally spending the next million, unaware that the golden tap had been turned off, and the reservoir was dry. She was a queen without a treasury, dancing on the edge of a cliff, while Jide stood back and waited for the wind to blow. The day before the gala, Jide told Joy he had a surprise, a pre-wedding gift that would symbolize the foundation of their future. He drove her away from the gleaming skyscrapers and the manicured districts, watching through the rearview mirror as the scenery shifted. The steel and glass dissolved into weathered brick and tangled power lines. They were entering the neighborhood where Jide had grown up, a place of loud markets and narrow streets that smelled of diesel and fried plantains. Joy's expression curdled like milk in the sun. She pulled her silk wrap tighter around her shoulders, as if the very air of the district might stain her skin. "Jide, why are we here? This area is unsanitary. We should be at the final fitting for my gown." "We're here for perspective," Jide fid, pulling up to a modest two-bedroom bungalow. The paint was peeling and the small front porch was cracked, but the structure was solid. It was the house next door to the one where he and Agnes had once lived. He stepped out and opened Joy's door. "I bought it this morning, in cash. I was thinking, Joy, life in the city is volatile. If the markets crashed, or if my board decided they'd had enough of me, we could lose the penthouse. This house represents security. It's a reminder that we don't need the gold to be happy. Could you live here with me? Just you, me, and my mother, starting over from scratch?" Joy didn't step out of the car. She looked at the house with a visceral, trembling disgust. "Is this a joke? A social experiment?" "I'm serious," Jide said, his voice dropping to a low, testing hum. "The accounts are becoming complicated. I might need to liquidate the penthouse to cover some unexpected debts. We could move in next week. Agnes already knows the neighbors." "I would rather die," she hissed, her voice cracking with the force of her contempt. She finally looked at him, the mask of the loving fiancé completely shattered. "I didn't spend 3 years climbing out of the gutter just to move back into a slum. If you lose your money, Jide, you lose me. I am a queen, and queens do not live in rot. And your mother, she belongs in a cellar, not in a house where people might actually see her. If you bring us here, I will leave you before the sun sets." Jide leaned against the car door, his eyes as cold as the deep sea. He had his answer. He had given her a chance to show a single spark of humanity, a solitary thread of loyalty that wasn't tied to a bank balance. She had failed. "I see," Jide said softly. "It's glad we had this talk, Joy. It's cleared up so many of my remaining uncertainties." "Drive me back," she commanded, turning her face away from the house, "and never speak of this place again." Jide put the car in gear. He wasn't driving her back to a future. He was driving her toward the end of her world, and he felt no pity at all. The night air at the rooftop lounge was thin and cold, much like the atmosphere between the two people sitting at the corner table. Jide had invited Joy for a pre-gala toast, choosing a venue known for its exclusivity and its high-strung staff. He had also chosen it for the small, innocuous-looking lapel pin fastened to his jacket, a pin that housed a high-definition lens, live streaming every second to a secure server. I'm just saying, Jide, your sudden fascination with the common man is becoming a distraction, Joy said, swirling her cocktail with an aggressive flick of her wrist. We have a brand to maintain. If you keep dragging us into the mud, people will start to think you've lost your edge, or worse, that you're becoming like your mother. Jide leaned back, his eyes fixed on her. And what exactly is your mother like, Joy? Before she could answer, a young waiter approached the table, his movements slightly hesitant as he balanced a tray with their appetizers. As he reached to set a plate down, a small bead of condensation from a glass dripped onto the sleeve of Joy's white silk blazer. The transformation was instantaneous. The soft, refined socialite vanished, replaced by a creature of pure, unadulterated venom. "You clumsy, pathetic idiot," Joy shrieked, her voice cutting through the ambient jazz of the lounge like a jagged blade. She didn't just move away. She stood up and shoved the tray back toward the waiter's chest, sending a glass of sparkling water shattering across the floor. "Do you have any idea what this costs? This jacket is worth more than your life. Look at me when I'm talking to you, you bottom feeder." The waiter stammered an apology, his face turning a humiliated shade of red, but Joy wasn't finished. She leaned over the table, her face inches from his, her features contorted into a mask of elitist rage. "People like you are why the world is a mess. You're lucky I don't have you fired and blacklisted from every establishment in this city. Get out of my sight before I lose my temper." "Joy, that's enough," Jide said, his voice dangerously calm. "It's not enough," she snapped, turning her fury on him. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You tolerate this mediocrity. You let people like him and people like your mother think they can touch us. They are tools, Jide. They are meant to serve, to be invisible, and to stay out of the way of people who actually matter." She sat back down, smoothing her hair with a trembling hand, her breathing heavy. Within seconds, she forced a smile, her eyes wide and innocent as she looked back at Jide. "I'm sorry, darling. I'm just stressed about the gala. I just want everything to be perfect for us." Jide looked at her, then glanced down at the small light on his lapel pin. It was a steady, glowing blue. He had it all. The world wouldn't just hear about her cruelty. They would see it in high definition. "Don't worry, Joy," Jide said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "The gala is going to be unforgettable." The grand ballroom of the King's Plaza was a cathedral of excess, shimmering with the reflected light of 1,000 hand-cut crystals. The air was thick with the scent of 5,000 white orchids and the quiet, rhythmic clinking of heavy silver against fine bone china. This was the pinnacle of Joy's ambition. She moved through the crowd like a conqueror, draped in a gown of spun gold that seemed to glow under the spotlights. She was the envy of every socialite in the room, the woman who had tamed the city's most elusive billionaire and secured her place at the top of the food chain. Jide stood on the raised dais, his tuxedo perfectly tailored, his expression a mask of impenetrable marble. Beside him, Joy preened, leaning into him for the benefit of the flickering camera flashes. She whispered into his ear, her voice a low purr of triumph. "Look at them, Jide. We own them. This is the legacy I was talking about. Tomorrow, no one will even remember where you came from. They will only see this." Jide's gaze swept over the room, but he wasn't looking at the CEOs or the heirs. He was looking at the massive 40-foot LED screens that flanked the stage, currently displaying a looping montage of the couple's charity work. He felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. He knew that behind the heavy velvet curtains to the left of the stage, Agnes was waiting. He had dressed her himself, in a gown of deep midnight blue, her hands finally clean and resting on her lap, though she still trembled at the thought of the light. The master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone, his voice booming over the expectant hush. Ladies and gentlemen, the moment you've all been waiting for, a special announcement from the man of the hour, Jide King. The applause was thunderous, a wave of sound that made Joy's eyes spark with predatory delight. She reached for the microphone first, wanting to steer the narrative, but Jide's hand was already there, his grip firm and unyielding. Tonight is about truth, Jide began, his voice amplified until it filled every corner of the hall, vibrating with a low, dangerous frequency. My fiancé has spent a lot of time talking about legacy and the image of this family. She has worked very hard to ensure that only the perfect parts of our lives are visible to you. Joy left nervously, touching his arm. Jide, darling, don't be so modest. We've done so much together. We have, Jide agreed, turning to look her directly in the eye. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. We have, Jide agreed, turning to look her directly in the eye. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. But tonight, I want to show you the part of my life Joy was most dedicated to, the part she spent $200,000 a month to keep hidden. He signaled to the tech booth. The lights in the ballroom dimmed to a sudden jarring black, and the giant screens flickered. The tension in the room reached a snapping point as the first image appeared. Not a charity gala, but a grainy, high-definition video of a kitchen floor. The screens didn't just flicker, they roared with the cold, unedited truth. The ambient chatter of the elite died instantly, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt physical. On 40 feet of high-definition LED, the images Jide had captured played out in a brutal loop. First, the hidden camera from the kitchen, Joy's designer heel hovering over Agnes's trembling fingers. The sound of her voice, sharp and jagged, demanding that his mother scrub harder. Then the footage from the rooftop lounge. Joy's face contorted into a mask of pure, elitist venom as she shrieked at the waiter, calling him a bottom feeder and claiming people like Agnes were mere tools. The gasps from the audience rippled through the ballroom like a physical wave. Joy's hand flew to her throat, her fingers tangling in the diamond necklace that Jide now knew had been bought with his mother's medical funds. She looked at the screens, then at the horrified faces of the billionaire investors she had worked so hard to impress, and finally at Jide. "Jide, stop this," she hissed, her voice cracking. "It's a deepfake. It's a trick. Someone hacked the system." Jide didn't move. He stood with his arms crossed, his silhouette dark against the glowing evidence of her cruelty. "The only hack in this room, Joy, is the one you performed on my life. You intercepted $200,000 a month intended for my mother's care. You forged medical reports. You threatened an innocent woman with an asylum to keep her in the shadows while you wore her dignity as a fashion accessory." As the video of Joy calling his mother a liability echoed through the speakers, Jide signaled to the side of the stage. The heavy velvet curtains parted, and Agnes stepped out. She looked nothing like the broken woman in the gray polyester uniform. She was radiant in midnight blue, her head held high, though her eyes were wet with tears of relief. The crowd stood in a stunned, collective hush as Jide walked over to his mother and took her hand, leading her to the center of the dais. He didn't look at Joy, who was now trembling, her golden gown looking like a tarnished cage. "This is Agnes King," Jide's voice boomed, steady and absolute. "The woman who built the foundation of everything I own, the woman you tried to erase." He turned to Joy, his eyes cold enough to freeze the blood in her veins. "The engagement is over, the accounts are frozen, and the police are waiting in the foyer to discuss the fraud and elder abuse charges. You wanted a legacy, Joy? Tonight, you finally have one." As the security details stepped onto the stage, Joy's knees buckled. She reached out for the podium to steady herself, but there was no support to be found. She was no queen no longer, just a hollow shadow, exposed in the blinding light of the truth she had tried so desperately to kill. The flashbulbs that had once signaled Joy's social triumph now felt like the sterile lighting of an interrogation room. As the security team moved in, the golden girl of the city's elite was stripped of her poise. She tried to maintain a shred of her former arrogance, pulling her arm away from a guard's grip, but the weight of 1,000 judging eyes anchored her to the floor. The crowd, which had whispered her name in envy only moments ago, now pulled back as she was led down the aisle, her designer gown rustling with a sound like dry leaves. Jide didn't watch her leave. He stood at the center of the stage, his hand firmly entwined with his mother's. Agnes looked out at the sea of powerful men and women, her face no longer hidden by shadows or shame. The trembling in her hands had stilled, replaced by a quiet ancestral dignity that no amount of polyester or bleach could ever truly scrub away. For years, Jide's voice rang out, no longer cold with vengeance, but resonant with a profound, newfound pride. This city has called me a self-made man. They looked at my companies and my assets and called me a visionary, but they were looking at the wrong person. He turned to Agnes, his eyes softening in a way the public had never seen. Every line of code I ever wrote was because this woman worked 3 jobs to keep the power on. Every negotiation I won was because she taught me that integrity is the only currency that never devalues. She didn't just survive for me. She built the man you see today. She is the true architect of the King legacy. A low, respectful murmur traveled through the ballroom, followed by a single, sharp clap that quickly grew into a standing ovation. This was not the polite applause of a social obligation. It was a tribute to the woman Joy had tried to make invisible. Jide leaned down and whispered something into his mother's ear, a private promise made in the middle of a public storm. He led her down the stairs of the dais, passing the empty front-row seats that had been reserved for Joy's high society friends. He didn't stop to network or to manage the PR fallout. He walked his mother straight to the exit, through the doors where his car was waiting, not to take them to the penthouse, but to the quiet, modest house in their old neighborhood. As the city lights blurred past the window, Agnes leaned her head against her son's shoulder. The temporary arrangement of her life as a ghost was over. Jide looked at his mother's reflection in the glass and realized that while he had spent years trying to give her a life of luxury, all she had ever wanted was to be seen. Tonight, the world had seen her, and for the first time in his life, Jide felt like a billionaire who finally knew exactly what his fortune was worth.